The 2028 presidential race is fastly approaching. In fact, we are just roughly 2.5 years away from electing a new president. Now, for some of you, you may be like, well, that's 2.5 years down the road. I'm really not worried about that at this current moment. I'm worried about the midterms. I'm worried about off-year elections, etc. But it's really important to start looking at these, as candidates will begin to announce in less than a year from now that they're going to be running for President of the United States in 2028. So today we're going to be talking about a hypothetical matchup of former Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of State Marco Rubio for the 2028 presidential race. Marco Rubio, the Republican nominee, Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for the second time, as this hypothetical matchup, and just seeing where everything lands in this personal prediction of mine. So, of course, with all of that said, let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to read through your thoughts and see what you guys think and see how you guys believe this map might shape out. So, with that said, I want to start by talking about some solid blue states. I'm just going to kind of go through here, click on some of these. These are states that I believe would go to the Democrats by probably over 15 percentage points. So, of course, a lot of these are, not even really talked about in a presidential election cycle. The only one I do want to discuss a little bit more in this specific video is New Jersey. New Jersey, in fact, went to Kamala Harris by a little over 5% in 2024. And in 2020, it was a state that had went to Joe Biden by a huge margin. I mean, we're talking double digits, similar to Virginia, where Kamala Harris only won by a little over 5%, but Joe Biden won by 10%. So a significant margin there nonetheless. So I'm going to leave that alone in this current map as it stands, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. So with that, I believe that's all of the Democratic states, solid Democratic states anyway, that I want to talk about at this point. Let's go ahead and talk about some of those safe Republican states. So we're looking at states like Utah, Wyoming, Montana, again, ones that we don't really hear too much about in presidential election cycles, especially because they are traditionally pretty red states, ones that we don't really hear of candidates going to, etc. So with this, Indiana, and I believe that kind of marks us up for Republican states that are going to be solid. So again, keep in mind this is going to be about a 15% margin. So I mean, we're looking at states like Texas. I'm sure some of you are going to be like, wow, well, Texas will obviously go by a huge margin, but not quite that 15 percentage point margin that we're looking for at this point. So I believe that's all of them. Let me double check real fast. Yeah, I think that's going to be all that we're going to put in at this point. So with that said, let's go ahead and start talking about some likely blue states, likely Democratic states, which are going to be states that go to the Democratic Party by somewhere between 5 and 15 percentage points. So a huge margin there, nonetheless, but an important one. We're talking about 5 to 15%, a pretty solidly blue area, but not quite in that completely solid blue to put it over that 15% threshold. So we're looking at states like New Mexico. Let me make sure I got that right. Here we go. New Mexico. We're also looking at states like Virginia. We're looking at states like New Jersey, like we discussed earlier. These are states that nonetheless we definitely think are going to be in that likely blue, likely Democratic area, talking 5 to 15 percentage points. And not really much else to say about that. I mean, these are states that have traditionally gone blue, but just haven't got to that point where they're safe Democratic states yet. They still have an opportunity for Republicans to win them, but again, like I've said throughout the video, just not this huge chance that some people might have you believe. So I believe that's going to be all of the likely Democratic states I'm going to characterize at this point. Actually, you know what? I'm going to actually characterize New Hampshire in there too. I also believe New Hampshire would be in that 5 to 15%. But other than that, I think that's going to be all that we're going to characterize at this point in the video on that one. So, with that said, let's move over to likely Republican states. So, we're looking at states like Texas, 5 to 15%. Again, a very likely outcome in the state of Texas. Also, Ohio, Iowa, and also probably Maine second. Also, would probably be a likely Republican area. So, we're talking again 5 to 15%. In those areas as well, Alaska as well. So then we're kind of left with those key battleground states that we always come back to: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. We also have Nebraska's 2nd district, and for whatever reason, I did not characterize the whole district. That's my apologies there. So we'll start by talking about Nebraska's 2nd, actually. I believe that this would be a lean Democratic area. So we're talking anywhere from 1% to 5%. I think Democrats still win this area overall. In this congressional district, this one electoral vote from the state of Nebraska, I don't really think it's too up in the air on that. I think that that's a pretty likely outcome that Nebraska's 2nd would be in that lean Democratic area. And I mean, that's about all I can say about the area overall. So with that, I want to go over and talk about the state of Nevada. This state actually went to President Trump for the first time in 2024, for the first time for Republicans since I believe it was like 2004. So about 20 years since it had went to the Republican Party, and President Trump flipped the state from 2020, from 2016, etc., etc. So with this said, I believe that it's very likely that we could see Marco Rubio really perform well here. But the issue is that Marco Rubio brings over a Trump voter base, but also doesn't bring over the MAGA base as well as President Trump does. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about these races: is can Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance or really any Republican bring over that MAGA base that's going to be needed to win elections that President Trump has turned out for the past 3 presidential election cycles? Are they going to be able to keep that? Not only that, is Marco Rubio going to be able to convince toss-up independent voters that he is the candidate who can lead the country best going forward, really? There's a lot of people, a lot of independents who are going to sit here and not be happy with the job that President Trump has done, and instead vote for change, vote for someone like Kamala Harris. And with that said, I believe Nevada is going to be in that lean Democratic area. So we're talking about 1 to 5%, probably closer to that 1% margin. I think it's still going to be really close, but I do believe that the Democrats end up winning this overall. I don't think that it would. I don't think it would be that big of an impact for Republicans to be able to overcome. I think that they would be able to, but I certainly believe that at this point, Kamala Harris is the favorite to win there. With that said, let's move on over to Arizona, where I also believe this is going to be a lean column for the candidate that I'll talk about in just a moment. So Arizona is an interesting state. Went to President Trump in 2016, went to Biden in 2020, went to President Trump in 2024. With that said, I believe out of all of the battleground states, Arizona is the most likely to continue in a Republican trending area. Of course, I'm interested to see some of the outcomes in the 2026 midterm cycle, specifically in this governor's race with Katie Hobbs. We'll see how this really shapes out. But as of this point, of course, it's still a pretty toss-up state, but it's certainly one that's worth talking about and worth noting the fact that Republicans have been able to perform as well as they have there. With that said, I believe Marco Rubio is going to pick up his first win in Arizona, keeping a state red that went to President Trump in 2024. With that said, I believe it's going to be in that lean Republican column like we've talked about throughout this video. I don't believe that Marco Rubio's in a spot where he's going to win Arizona, by a huge margin over 5% or anything, but I believe 1 to 5% is pretty likely, probably somewhere around 3% in a state like Arizona. With that said, let's move over and talk about some of these other states such as North Carolina and Georgia. We'll start with North Carolina. This state has went to President Trump in all three of his elections that he's ran in 2016, 2020, and 2024. He's been able to win the state of North Carolina. It's slowly trending blue. It's always been a toss-up state, but there are signs of the state slowly but surely trending blue. It actually was a closer state in 2024 than, like we said, Arizona, for instance. So very important there nonetheless. But with that said, I believe that North Carolina is going to stay in that Republican trending area. Now, I'm interested to see this Senate race in 2026. I have no doubt, like if you've watched other videos of mine, you know how I view the state of North Carolina in the 2026 midterms. I believe that that Roy Cooper is going to win that Senate seat in North Carolina, no doubt. And I'm interested to see that margin against someone like Michael Whatley. But as of this point, I think Marco Rubio has just enough to be able to win this state again. With that said, it's going to be in that lean Republican area, so anywhere from 1 to 5%, probably somewhere closer to 2% if I was guessing today, again, 2.5 years out from this race. That's what I would personally predict. With that said, let's move over and talk about Georgia. Another state, very interesting nonetheless. 2016, President Trump wins it. 2020, Biden wins it barely. And 2024, President Trump wins it again, but by a pretty slim margin, really. I mean, Georgia is certainly trending in a blue area and certainly continues to be a toss-up state. With that said, Marco Rubio is a more independent candidate. He doesn't have a lot of, should I say, baggage that carries over from someone like President Trump. Of course, he's tied with the president, but he's his own person, and he's ran for president before in 2016, but lost the nomination. So could he win a state like Georgia right next to his home state of Florida? Yes. Is it likely? Probably. I think that Marco Rubio is going to be able to win the state of Georgia by a pretty solid margin. I mean, again, not huge, not this likely margin, 5+%, but a lean margin. I think he'll win it by probably 1.5% to 2%. And I say that because Georgia voters are probably going to look at Marco Rubio as a newcomer, as someone who sure was tied into the administration, but also is someone who Republicans can trust as a new face for the party. So in this certain election, I believe that Marco Rubio could win the state of Georgia in a 2028 hypothetical matchup against Kamala Harris. So now that we're here, we're left with the blue wall, as it's known before 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. 3 states that will decide the outcome of this election. If Marco Rubio wins any of these 3 states, he wins the presidency. If Kamala Harris sweeps them, she wins. So what happens in these states? Well, it's going to be really fascinating to look at these states throughout 2028 as well. Again, all 3 of these states went to President Trump in 2016, flipped to President Biden in 2020, and then flipped back to President Trump in 2024. So after 4 years of President Trump, are they going to be able to flip to the Democrats where Kamala Harris could win this presidency, or is just one going to make Marco Rubio win this race? Well, let's start by talking about the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin is another state, like we said, all 3 of these, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all 3 went to President Trump, then Biden, then Trump again. So with that said, it's going to be interesting, but I certainly believe if anybody can do it, if anybody can win these states, it could be Marco Rubio. But with that said, I also believe there's going to be a high likelihood that they look at this as we've had 4 years of President Trump, we don't want 4 more. For that reason, not only am I going to put Wisconsin, but I'm also going to put Michigan in a lean Democratic contention. So we're talking about a margin that's going to be anywhere from 1 to 5%. Wisconsin, I think, is going to be the closest. I think we honestly could see it being in that tilt Democratic area where we're looking at Kamala Harris not able to win that by over 1%. In fact, that's probably likely. She might not be able to win this by 1%, but I think she might just win. Same thing for Michigan. She might not win it by over a percentage point, but I think that she probably would in this certain outcome. With that said, we're moving on to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to decide this race. Kamala Harris wins it, she wins the presidency. Marco Rubio wins it, he wins the presidency. So, with this said, Pennsylvania has always decided elections. I mean, when we talked about it in 2020, we talked about it in 2024, it was going to be a deciding point. It comes back down to that today. In this hypothetical matchup, can Marco Rubio pull off enough voters to be able to win the state of Pennsylvania? Or is Kamala Harris going to be able to flip it from 2024, winning the presidential race? I think that this is a really hard race to predict. I think that overall, all of these states have been very difficult. Specifically, these states in the blue wall, Wisconsin and Michigan, are extremely hard to predict. Pennsylvania, that much harder. But I think Marco Rubio could win the state of Pennsylvania. I think it would be close. I think we're talking about probably a likely outcome, or a lean outcome, my apologies, anywhere from 1 to 5%, like we've talked about throughout this video. I think that that's the most likely scenario, that he would win by a low margin in that. So probably 1.5%. I think somewhere in that area is probably the likely outcome there. And Marco Rubio wins this prediction. Why? Because I believe between someone like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio's able to chip off more independents than someone like J.D. Vance, also bringing a new face who can say, yeah, I was the Secretary of State under President Trump, but I'm different. I'm different because of XYZ reason. J.D. Vance is going to have a hard time. He's really tied to President Trump, who at this point is really unpopular. But if the Republican Party nominates someone like Marco Rubio, they might really have a chance to win this race. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you believe any of these states are different than the way I predicted them? Do you believe the blue wall is completely wrong, that Republicans would win Wisconsin and Michigan? Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I love reading through those and getting your guys' insight as well. So with that said, don't forget to like and subscribe. I have a list of links in the description below that you can check out, the Instagram, TikTok, etc. I'm going to try and be posting on those more frequently. So with that, again, thank you guys again so much for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.